The US will send £1 billion in fresh aid to Ukraine. It comes after President Joe Biden and Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky shared a phone call today.
Cost of this fight is not cheap, but caving to aggression is going to be more costly if we allow it to happen. We either back Ukrainian people as they defend their country, or we stand by as the Russians continue their atrocities and aggression in Ukraine.
President Biden speaking there. The assistance package includes coastal defence weapons and advanced rocket systems for the Donbass fight. NATO ministers of defence met in Brussels today to discuss supplying additional weaponry to Ukraine, the third such meeting since the war began. And we can now speak to Rose Gottemoeller, the former Deputy Secretary of NATO. Good evening.
Good evening to you.
So, please explain to us about this. Washington's releasing $1 billion in new security assistance to Kiev. First of all, you can give us some idea whether that's a lot of money or a little. It's very difficult for people who are not familiar with these to be able to judge how much that is in the scheme of things. And secondly, why new? Have they learned things they didn't know before? So explain to us why they're doing it now rather than earlier.
Well, it is the largest single tranche of military weapons and equipment since the war began. So $1 billion in that regard is a lot of money. And I think it will be used to good effect in that it is providing for anti-ship missile launchers, howitzers, and more rounds for the so-called HIMARS system, the high mobility artillery rocket systems. These are all key weapon systems that the Ukrainians have been constantly requesting and doing so on a very urgent basis. So apparently in their phone call today, President Zelensky expressed some satisfaction about this package.
It's not, this is therefore not cash, it's equipment, and that's what they're really after.
Oh, absolutely. Cash coming in, I suppose they'd be happy enough, but they actually urgently need the equipment. And if you have cash to hand, you have to purchase equipment somewhere, and it's not easy if you are at war to be able to effect those purchases quickly and effectively. So having the United States actually providing the equipment directly is a good thing.
So explain where it comes from. That's the new bit that I'm trying to understand. They've got this equipment somewhere already built. What was it being built for, and what was its previous destination before this happened?
Well, I'm assuming that these are from U.S. stocks. I don't actually have that confirmed, but I am assuming the reason they are able to move it so quickly is that it is from existing U.S. stocks. These are pieces of equipment, artillery material that have already been built and essentially were being held in storage and reserve for the use of the U.S. armed forces. So they are not hot off the production line, as far as I know.
Does this sort of aid enjoy widespread support in the United States? There's always been a battle, hasn't there, between internationalists and to use the term isolationists, those people who think that you need to put America first by not getting yourself involved in foreign entanglements, those people who think you ought to put America first precisely by getting involved in foreign entanglements. So how's this playing out in the US?
What is so ironic about this whole terrible war in Ukraine is that President Putin has actually driven everyone in the opposite direction from what he wanted. He is always intent on separating Americans, driving further division in America. Instead, this has turned into a big bipartisan area of agreement, unusual for our system. Same with NATO. He's driven NATO together to be working more closely than certainly I when I was Deputy Secretary General. So again, it's 180 degrees different from what Vladimir Putin wanted, and that's a heavy irony.
If a Russian media spokesman or President Putin himself said this amount of money, this amount of equipment, this amounts to a NATO involvement in this war. It is effectively becoming a participant, and that justifies Russia in seeking to strike against nations that are engaged in a war with it. How would you seek to persuade them that that was an unreasonable analysis?
Certainly, I can't speak for exactly what the thinking is in Moscow at the moment, but I can say what they are doing, and that is that they are, as they've threatened, attacking shipments of NATO countries armaments and other war materiel, equipment of all kinds, but they are striking those pieces of equipment when they arrive in Ukraine. They are not touching NATO territory, and I believe, therefore, that the Russians are deterred, strongly deterred from getting into a fight with NATO because they realize that they are very stretched thin along that 1,000-kilometer front that they have in the east and south of Ukraine. They barely have the personnel to manage that front at the moment, and to have to take on the entire NATO alliance, they don't want to do it. So I do believe that they are moment, exactly the opposite of what you are talking about. They're not tempted.
Okay, well, explain to us what an attack on NATO, how NATO understands what an attack on NATO is. We can assume that it means, certainly at the minimum, an attack on NATO mainlands. But is beyond that, what would you regard, or not you, but the organisation regard, as an attack on one part of NATO that necessitated a response from the whole of NATO?
Any kinetic attack on NATO territory is seen in this light, and that means the use of conventional weaponry of any kind on against a NATO target. What has become a new development in recent years are the so-called hybrid attacks, or as we say, gray area attacks, cyber attacks on NATO targets, and these are a constant, and they have been a constant for years. Again, while I was at NATO 3-4 years ago, we were constantly defending against cyber attacks, some of which we knew were coming from the Russian Federation. So there's a strong necessity of defending against such attacks, but in the case of NATO, that defense has not resulted in kinetic escalation, and I think that is now essentially a well-established practice.
Yesterday, the Pope rather extraordinarily said he felt that this conflict had been at least in part provoked by NATO, presumably for someone who's worked in NATO during the period which must be covered by the Pope's so-called provocation. You regard that remark in itself as quite provoking?
I'm on the record as recollecting the degree to which NATO, for the practically the whole period since the breakup of the Soviet Union 30 years ago, but NATO has worked hard to try to turn Russia into a partner and a country that NATO wanted to work with for security in Europe. It was Vladimir Putin himself who signed the Rome Declaration in 2002 that established the so-called NATO-Russia Council, and that launched a whole series of very pragmatic projects that NATO and Russia worked on for many years, for over a decade, until essentially the Russians marched in and seized Crimea in 2014. So I think history is picture a bit differently from what Pope Francis was speaking about yesterday. I'm hoping he'll get a look at that history and reflect on it.
If Ukraine had been one of the countries that NATO had expanded to, this wouldn't have happened, would it?
Well, again, you're asking a theoretical question that I think it's impossible to speculate on. I do not know. I do know that the Ukrainians have been so effective in the fight up to this point is that after the Crimean invasion in 2014, NATO began working intensively with the Ukrainian armed forces to bring them up to modern combat standards. And it's that combat effectiveness that has helped Ukraine, a much smaller armed force than the Russian armed forces, to continue to defend their territory so effectively.
Well, thank you very much to Rose Gottemoeller, the former Deputy Secretary General of NATO.